It was a warm summer morning, the kind of day that makes you forget the worries of the world, and the Smith family was ready for a much-needed vacation. Marcus Smith, his wife Lisa, and their two children, Sam and Grace, were heading to their favorite vacation spot, Ocean View Beach Resort, a luxurious retreat in the coastal town of Clearwater. The sun was bright, the ocean waves were calling, and everything seemed perfect. At least, it was supposed to be. The drive had been peaceful, filled with the typical family road trip banter. Sam, the older child, was talking about how excited he was to swim in the ocean, while little Grace was already planning her sandcastle empire. Marcus, a well-dressed man in his early 40s with a quiet demeanor, glanced over at Lisa and smiled. He felt grateful for this time off from his intense job as a federal agent, though few outside his closest circle knew the full extent of his work. They arrived at Ocean View Beach Resort just after noon, greeted by the towering palm trees and the sound of distant waves. The place was busy, as expected for summer, with families, couples, and tourists scattered across the property. As they pulled into the parking lot, Lisa pointed out the beautiful beachfront view. It was going to be the perfect week, or so they thought. As the family began unloading their luggage, Marcus noticed a couple of hotel staff eyeing them strangely from across the parking lot. He brushed it off, chalking it up to the natural curiosity of people seeing new arrivals. But those looks lingered, and soon a couple of guests began whispering amongst themselves as they walked by. Lisa noticed too and gave Marcus a puzzled look. "Maybe they've never seen a family as good-looking as us," Marcus joked, trying to ease the tension. They laughed it off, but the unease remained. Marcus, being the observant man he was, knew something felt off. Still, it was their vacation, and he didn't want to dampen the mood. He grabbed the suitcases from the trunk and headed toward the hotel entrance. As they reached the lobby, Marcus volunteered to go back and grab the last of their bags while Lisa checked them in. He had just made it back to their car when two uniformed police officers walked up, their hands resting on their belts, eyes locked on Marcus. "Sir, we need to speak with you for a moment," one of the officers said, his tone flat but authoritative. Marcus looked up, confused but calm. "Is there a problem, officer?" "We received a report of suspicious behavior in the parking lot," the second officer said, his eyes narrowing slightly. "We need to ask you a few questions." Marcus raised an eyebrow. "Suspicious behavior? I'm just here with my family for vacation. Is there something specific you're concerned about?" The officers exchanged glances, their postures stiffening. One of them stepped closer, his hand now hovering near his baton. "We need you to identify yourself and tell us what you're doing here." The situation was escalating quickly, and Marcus could sense the tension in the air. He kept his voice level and calm. "I'm Marcus Smith. I'm staying here with my family. We're just checking in for a vacation." One officer scoffed. "I'm going to need to see some ID." Now, Marcus reached for his wallet, moving slowly to avoid any misunderstanding. "Sure thing, here's my ID. Like I said, we're just here for a family vacation." As he handed over his driver's license, Marcus noticed Lisa and the kids watching from the lobby, worry etched across their faces. He could see the confusion in their eyes, wondering why the police were talking to him. He gave them a small, reassuring nod, though inside, his frustration was beginning to build. The officer looked at the ID briefly, then handed it back with a smirk. "You don't look like you belong here. Are you sure you're not up to something?" Marcus's expression remained neutral, but his patience was wearing thin. "I don't understand what this is about. We're just trying to enjoy a family vacation. Is there something specific you need from me?" Without warning, the second officer moved behind Marcus, grabbing his arms and yanking them behind his back. Marcus, startled, tried to turn his head, but the officer shoved him against the side of the car, slapping a pair of handcuffs onto his wrists. "You're under arrest for resisting questioning and causing a disturbance," the first officer barked. "What? Resisting? I haven't done anything wrong, Marcus protested, his voice still calm but firmer now. Lisa rushed out of the hotel, Sam and Grace trailing behind her, their eyes wide with fear. What are you doing? Why are you arresting him? He hasn't done anything, Lisa yelled, panic rising in her voice. The officers ignored her, shoving Marcus into the back of the police cruiser. The kids began to cry, their voices breaking as they called for their dad. Marcus tried to calm them down from inside the car, but the doors had already been slammed shut, and his voice couldn't reach them. Lisa stood in disbelief, watching as the officers drove off with her husband. The resort staff gathered around, murmuring and staring. One of the hotel managers finally approached her. "Ma'am, I'm so sorry, but we had to report the situation," the manager said, barely meeting her eyes. "We received a complaint from some guests about suspicious behavior." Lisa couldn't believe what she was hearing. Suspicious behavior? We were just parking our car. What kind of place is this where you call the cops on a family for no reason? The manager looked uncomfortable but said nothing more. Lisa, trembling with anger, pulled out her phone and dialed the first person she could think of, Marcus's colleague at the FBI. Inside the police car, Marcus remained eerily calm. As the officers drove, they started talking amongst themselves, not realizing who they had in the back seat. "You'd think people like him would know better than to act suspicious around here," one officer muttered. Marcus listened quietly, assessing the situation. He knew this was a clear case of racial profiling. They had no idea who he was, not just an ordinary father on vacation, but a high-ranking FBI agent trained to handle high-stakes situations. The car pulled into the police station, and Marcus was escorted out, still handcuffed. The officers led him into the station, smugly ignoring his attempts to explain the misunderstanding. As they began the formal arrest process, Marcus remained calm, biding his time. When they finally asked him for a formal statement, Marcus quietly said, "Before we go any further, you might want to call the FBI. You've just arrested one of your own." The room went silent. Before that summer day when everything changed, Marcus Smith lived a life of contrasts. To the outside world, he was an ordinary man, the kind of person you'd meet at a neighborhood barbecue or see coaching his son's little league game. He was soft-spoken, rarely drawing attention to himself, and always carried an air of quiet confidence. He preferred his life to be unremarkable, free from complications. But behind this calm facade was a man who carried the weight of extraordinary responsibilities. Marcus wasn't just a family man. He was a highly trained FBI agent, a specialist in counterterrorism and undercover operations. His life was anything but ordinary. The only thing more important to him than his job was his family. And they were the reason he fought so hard to keep his professional life hidden from view. Only a few people knew the full extent of Marcus's career, his wife Lisa being one of them. For years, Marcus had operated in dangerous situations, infiltrating criminal networks, handling sensitive national security threats, and doing the type of work that never made the news but kept countless Americans safe. His ability to remain calm under pressure was legendary within his circles, a skill honed from years of fieldwork in high-stakes operations where one wrong move could spell disaster. But for all the excitement and risk, Marcus had always made it a priority to protect his family from the dangers that came with his job. His children, Sam and Grace, only knew that their dad worked for the government, but they never asked for more details. In their eyes, he was just a regular dad, always there to cheer them on at school events, take them fishing on weekends, and read them bedtime stories about far-off adventures. Marcus loved this duality, the simplicity of his family life in contrast to the complex, often dangerous work he did for the FBI. Just a few months before the vacation, Marcus had wrapped up one of the most challenging cases of his career. He had spent nearly 2 years undercover, posing as a businessman to infiltrate a human trafficking ring that spanned multiple states. The operation required him to live a double life, pretending to be someone he wasn't, and constantly walking a tightrope of danger. There were moments when the line between his real identity and his undercover persona blurred, but Marcus never lost sight of why he was doing it: to bring down a criminal network that had destroyed countless lives. The case had been mentally and physically exhausting. During the operation, Marcus couldn't tell his family where he was going, and for long stretches, Lisa had to keep the household running on her own. Marcus missed birthdays, school events, and family dinners, which ate at him more than he ever let on. He justified the sacrifices by reminding himself that once the operation was over, he could return to being the father and husband his family needed. The sting had been a success, leading to the arrest of several high-profile criminals. But as with any major operation, there were loose ends. Some of the individuals Marcus had helped take down were still awaiting trial, and there was always the chance of retaliation. This was why Marcus remained cautious, even in his private life. He had learned early in his career that danger could come from unexpected places, and he needed to be vigilant, even when he was off duty. Once the case was closed, Marcus had promised Lisa and the kids that they would take a family vacation. It was his way of making up for all the lost time, a chance to reconnect and enjoy some peace after the chaos of the past 2 years. Lisa had picked Ocean View Beach Resort for its family-friendly reputation and serene atmosphere. They had been there before, and it had always felt like a safe, welcoming place. Marcus had been looking forward to the trip, not just because it was a break from work, but because he needed to clear his mind. The stress of the job had started to take its toll, and while he was used to dealing with dangerous situations, the constant pressure had become exhausting. He saw this vacation as a way to hit the reset button, to focus on his family, and to remind himself why he did what he did. Little did Marcus know that this vacation would be anything but peaceful. As they checked into the resort, Marcus couldn't help but notice the way people were looking at them. It wasn't the first time he had felt it. That sense of being out of place, of not belonging. Despite his success and his career, Marcus had never been immune to the subtle, and sometimes not so subtle, racism that still permeated society. Growing up as a black man in America, Marcus had experienced racial profiling before. He knew the looks, the assumptions, the way people would cross the street to avoid him, or the way store clerks would follow him around, assuming he might steal something. It was something he had learned to navigate, to let roll off his back, but it always stung. No matter how far he had come in his career, no matter how much he had achieved, to some people, he would always be seen as a threat because of the color of his skin. That day at the resort, the stares felt more pointed, more judgmental. Marcus shrugged it off, telling himself it was just his imagination. After all, they were in a nice place, surrounded by families just like theirs. What could go wrong? As the afternoon sun beat down, Marcus made his way back to the parking lot to grab the last of their luggage. He hadn't noticed the couple by the front desk, whispering and glancing in his direction. He didn't see the hotel clerk make a phone call shortly after they checked in, alerting the police to suspicious activity involving a black man in the parking lot. Marcus was focused on his family and their vacation, unaware of the storm brewing just out of sight. Back at the car, Marcus was in the middle of grabbing a suitcase when he heard the sound of approaching footsteps. He turned around to see 2 police officers walking toward him, their expressions unreadable but their posture tense. Something was off, and Marcus's instincts, honed from years in law enforcement, kicked in immediately. He knew this was more than just a routine check. "Sir, we need to ask you a few questions," one of the officers said, his tone laced with suspicion. Marcus kept his cool, explaining that he was on vacation with his family and that they had just checked in. But as he spoke, he could see the officers weren't listening. Their minds were already made up, and nothing he said was going to change that. What followed was a whirlwind of events that Marcus would later replay over and over in his mind. The demand for ID, the sudden accusation of suspicious behavior, the rough handcuffing in front of his terrified children. In that moment, Marcus realized that nothing about his background or his achievements mattered. To these officers, he was just another black man they had decided didn't belong. Inside the police cruiser, as the officers drove him away from the resort, Marcus remained calm. Years of FBI training had taught him to stay composed in even the most chaotic situations. But as the reality of what was happening sank in, he couldn't help but feel a deep sense of frustration. He had spent his career fighting to protect the rights and freedoms of others. Yet here he was, handcuffed and humiliated, simply because of the color of his skin. As the police car pulled into the station, Marcus took a deep breath. He knew that once the truth came out, once the officers realized they had arrested a federal agent, everything would change. But that didn't erase the fact that this never should have happened in the first place. Inside the police cruiser, as the officers drove him away from the resort, Marcus remained calm. Years of FBI training had taught him to stay composed in even the most chaotic situations. But as the reality of what was happening sank in, he couldn't help but feel a deep sense of frustration. He had spent his career fighting to protect the rights and freedoms of others. Yet here he was, handcuffed and humiliated, simply because of the color of his skin. As the police car pulled into the station, Marcus took a deep breath. He knew that once the truth came out, once the officers realized they had arrested a federal agent, everything would change. But that didn't erase the fact that this never should have happened in the first place. For Marcus, this wasn't just about the arrest. It was about the larger issue at hand. The systemic racism that allowed these kinds of incidents to happen every day to people who didn't have the privilege of an FBI badge to protect them. Marcus knew he would walk out of that station soon enough, but the damage had already been done. As they processed his arrest, one of the officers finally asked Marcus what he did for a living. "I work for the FBI," Marcus said, his voice calm but firm. The room fell silent. The officer blinked, not quite sure he had heard correctly. "You're an FBI agent?" Marcus nodded. "That's right. And you've just arrested me for no reason." The officer's face drained of color. In that moment, he realized they had made a huge mistake. Marcus sat silently in the small interrogation room, a place he knew all too well from the other side of the table. The cold, sterile air, the hum of fluorescent lights, and the smell of stale coffee reminded him of countless interviews he had conducted in his career as an FBI agent. But this time, the roles were reversed. He was the one in handcuffs, accused of a crime that didn't exist. The irony was almost too much to bear. Across from him sat two officers, their faces betraying a mix of discomfort and confusion. They were waiting for someone higher up to arrive, someone who could explain the situation that was quickly spiraling out of control. Neither officer spoke much. They were clearly unsure of how to proceed after realizing they had arrested a federal agent without cause. Marcus, maintaining his calm demeanor, glanced around the room, his mind replaying the events of the past few hours. From the moment those officers had approached him at the resort, he knew what was happening. This wasn't about a legitimate concern over suspicious behavior. This was racial profiling, plain and simple. It wasn't the first time Marcus had faced something like this, but it was certainly the most extreme. Lisa was out there somewhere, probably frantic by now, trying to figure out what to do next. Marcus trusted her completely. She was smart, resourceful, and knew exactly how to get things done when it mattered. But he couldn't help but think about their children, Sam and Grace. The image of their terrified faces as he was taken away haunted him. This was the part that hurt the most. The knowledge that his children were witnessing firsthand the kind of racism and injustice he had tried so hard to shield them from. At the Ocean View Beach Resort, Lisa was in a state of shock. The manager's indifferent explanation about suspicious behavior had done nothing to calm her fears. She knew Marcus better than anyone. He was the most careful, conscientious person she had ever known. The idea that he would do something to warrant police intervention was absurd. Yet here she was, standing in the middle of a resort lobby, watching her husband be taken away in handcuffs as if he were a common criminal. Sam and Grace clung to her legs, their small bodies shaking with fear. Lisa knelt down, wrapping her arms around them, trying to comfort them even though she felt like screaming. How had this happened? How had what was supposed to be a relaxing family vacation turned into this nightmare? Lisa's mind raced as she pulled out her phone and dialed the number she hoped she'd never have to use. Marcus had always been prepared for situations like this. He knew the risks of his job and what could happen if the wrong people found out who he was. He had given her a list of contacts, just in case, and at the top of that list was Special Agent James Carter, Marcus's direct supervisor at the FBI. "Lisa, what's wrong?" James answered after just one ring, his voice immediately concerned. "They arrested Marcus," Lisa said, her voice shaking with both fear and anger. "The police, they just took him away. They said he was acting suspicious. You need to do something. Please." There was a pause on the other end of the line, but only for a moment. James Carter was nothing if not decisive. "I'll handle it. I'm calling the local precinct right now. Stay where you are. I'll call you back as soon as I know more." Lisa hung up and took a deep breath, trying to steady herself. The kids were still clinging to her, their faces pale with confusion. She knelt down again, smoothing their hair and whispering that everything was going to be okay, even though she wasn't sure if that was true. Back at the police station, Marcus was still sitting in the interrogation room, waiting. The two officers hadn't asked him many questions since they realized he was FBI, but they hadn't released him either. They were clearly in over their heads, unsure of what to do next. Just then, the door swung open, and a new figure entered the room. It was the precinct captain, a tall man with graying hair and a hardened expression. He walked in with an air of authority, but also discomfort, knowing full well the gravity of the situation. He had just gotten off the phone with James Carter at the FBI, and knew that this was about to become a mess. "Mr. Smith, I'm Captain Dawson," the man said, sitting down across from Marcus. "I've been informed that there's been a misunderstanding. Let's get this cleared up." Marcus looked at the man without saying a word for a moment, letting the silence hang in the air. He wanted to see how Dawson would handle this. Would he be the type to own up to the mistake, or would he try to cover it up and sweep it under the rug? Marcus had dealt with both types during his career. "I appreciate that, Captain," Marcus said calmly. "But this isn't just a misunderstanding. This is racial profiling. Your officers arrested me because I'm a black man who didn't look like I belonged at that resort. That's not a misunderstanding. That's systemic racism." Dawson's face tightened, but he nodded. "I'm not going to argue with you, Mr. Smith. I understand you're with the FBI, and I can assure you that we'll be looking into the actions of the officers involved. I've already spoken with your supervisor, and we're working to get this resolved as quickly as possible." Marcus leaned forward slightly. "Resolved? You think letting me go is going to resolve this? I was handcuffed in front of my wife and kids. Do you have any idea what that does to a family? To children?" Dawson's discomfort grew, but he maintained his professionalism. "I'm not going to make excuses for what happened. You have every right to file a complaint, and if you choose to do so, it will be taken seriously. But right now, I want to make sure you get home to your family." Marcus stared at the man for a moment longer, weighing his options. He could make this difficult, could push harder, but right now, all he wanted was to get back to Lisa and the kids. They were the ones who mattered most. The battle for justice could come later. "Fine," Marcus said finally, his voice low but steady. "Get me out of these handcuffs." Within the hour, Marcus was released, and the officers who had arrested him were nowhere to be seen. Captain Dawson personally escorted him out of the station, apologizing again for the mistake. Marcus kept his responses short, focusing on getting out of there and back to his family. As he walked out into the afternoon sun, Marcus spotted Lisa and the kids waiting for him across the street. The moment they saw him, Sam and Grace broke into a run, tears streaming down their faces as they launched themselves into his arms. Lisa followed close behind, her face a mixture of relief and anger. Marcus held his family close, feeling the weight of the day's events finally settle on his shoulders. This wasn't over, not by a long shot, but for now, he was just glad to be back with the people he loved most. As they walked back to the car, Marcus's phone buzzed in his pocket. He glanced at the screen and saw a text message from a number he didn't recognize. "We know who you are, Agent Smith. You've made powerful enemies. Watch your back." Marcus's heart skipped a beat as he stared at the message. He had suspected that his undercover work might come back to haunt him, but he hadn't expected it to happen like this. Not here, not now. Was this incident really just about racial profiling, or was there something more sinister at play? As he slipped his phone back into his pocket, Marcus knew one thing for sure. The nightmare wasn't over. It was just beginning. Later that evening, back at the resort, Marcus and Lisa sat together on the balcony of their hotel room, watching the waves crash against the shore. The kids were asleep, exhausted from the emotional toll of the day, but Marcus and Lisa couldn't rest. "We can't stay here," Lisa said quietly, her voice full of worry. "I don't feel safe anymore." Marcus nodded. "I know. We'll leave first thing in the morning. But there's more going on here, Lisa. I got a text. From someone. They know who I am. This wasn't just about racism. Someone targeted us." Lisa's eyes widened with fear. "What do you mean? Who?" "I don't know," Marcus admitted, "but I need to find out. This isn't just about us anymore. This is bigger than we realized." As they sat in the quiet night, the weight of the situation settled over them like a dark cloud. Marcus knew that his job had always carried risks, but now those risks had followed him home, invading the one place he thought he could keep safe, his family. The tension was far from over, and as Marcus prepared for what came next, he knew that the truth was still buried deep. He was about to uncover something far more dangerous than he had anticipated. The cool morning breeze of the coast brushed against Marcus's face as he stepped out onto the balcony. The rising sun painted the horizon in shades of pink and gold, a stark contrast to the storm brewing within him. It had been a restless night. The weight of the previous day's events hung over him like a dark cloud, but something else gnawed at the back of his mind. The text message. "We know who you are, Agent Smith. You've made powerful enemies. Watch your back." Those words had ignited a new level of anxiety within Marcus. He had spent his entire career moving in and out of dangerous situations, but his family had always been off limits. Now, everything felt different. The racial profiling at the resort was already appalling enough, but this message suggested something more sinister, something targeted. Lisa joined him on the balcony, wrapping a shawl around her shoulders. Her eyes were tired, her face still etched with the tension from the day before. She sipped her coffee in silence for a moment before speaking. "We can't stay here, Marcus," she said softly. "We have to get out of here today. I can't shake the feeling that something worse is coming." Marcus nodded. He knew she was right, but they couldn't leave without understanding the full picture. The local police had already exposed their incompetence, but now Marcus was facing a different threat, one that wasn't bound by local law enforcement. "I know," Marcus replied, his voice low. "But this is bigger than yesterday's arrest. That message wasn't random. Someone knew exactly who I was, and they want me to know they're watching. If I don't figure this out, we'll never be safe." Lisa's eyes widened slightly, fear creeping into her expression. "Do you think this has something to do with your last operation? The trafficking ring?" Marcus took a deep breath. "It's possible. After the arrests were made, there were loose ends, people who disappeared before we could apprehend them. I thought they might lay low, but maybe they're bolder than we expected. And now, it seems like they've found me." They sat in silence for a while, the ocean waves crashing in the distance. The peaceful sound did little to soothe the turmoil in their hearts. Just as Marcus was about to suggest they pack up and leave, his phone buzzed again. This time, it wasn't a threat. It was a call from James Carter, his supervisor at the FBI. "Marcus, I just got off the phone with the precinct," James said without preamble. "They're running damage control, but I know this isn't just about yesterday's arrest. Something else is going on, isn't it?" "Yeah," Marcus said, his voice tight. "I got a message last night. Someone knows who I am." This was no coincidence. James paused on the other end. "I figured as much. I had a bad feeling when I heard about what happened at the resort. I've been digging around since you called, and I think you might be right. There's chatter, unconfirmed but credible, about a group connected to the trafficking ring you dismantled. They've been looking for you." Marcus felt a chill run down his spine. This wasn't just paranoia. It was real. Why now? Why would they come after me now? James hesitated before responding. "It looks like they've regrouped. Some of the individuals who went underground have resurfaced. We think they might be planning to rebuild their network. And you? Well, you're the one who took them down. They see you as a threat." Marcus clenched his jaw. He had known that his work would put a target on his back, but he had hoped it wouldn't spill over into his personal life. Now that hope seemed naive. "I need to know everything," Marcus said. "Who are we dealing with? How close are they?" "We're still gathering intel," James replied. "But here's what I know. There's a key player we never caught. Gustavo Ortega. He was the mastermind behind the trafficking ring, and he vanished right before we could arrest him. Word is, he's resurfaced and looking for revenge. You need to be careful, Marcus. This guy is dangerous." Marcus's heart sank. Ortega was a name that sent shivers down the spines of even the most hardened law enforcement officers. Ruthless, cunning, and always one step ahead, Ortega had built an empire of human suffering. Marcus had spent years tracking him, but in the end, Ortega had slipped through his fingers. And now, it seemed, Ortega was back. As soon as Marcus hung up with James, he turned to Lisa. "We need to leave now. I'll call the FBI for backup, but we can't stay here any longer." Lisa didn't hesitate. "I'll pack up the kids." They moved quickly, gathering their things and loading the car. Sam and Grace, still shaken from the events of the day before, asked no questions. They sensed the urgency in their parents' actions and stayed quiet as the family prepared to leave. Just as they were about to pull out of the resort parking lot, Marcus's phone buzzed again. It was another message, this time from an unknown number. "You can run, Agent Smith, but you can't hide. We're closer than you think." Marcus's hands gripped the steering wheel tightly. He glanced around the parking lot, his eyes scanning for any sign of danger. Were they already here? Was someone watching them right now? He turned to Lisa. "We're not going straight home. We're heading to a safe house." Lisa nodded, trusting his instincts completely. She knew Marcus had contingency plans for situations like this, even if she had hoped they would never need to use them. The drive was tense, but uneventful. Marcus led them to a secluded cabin about 2 hours away from the resort, deep in the woods. It was one of several safe houses the FBI maintained for emergencies. The location was off the grid, and only a select few knew about it. As they arrived at the cabin, Marcus felt a small sense of relief. For now, they were safe, but he knew it was only a matter of time before Ortega's people found them again. Inside, the cabin was simple but secure. Marcus made sure the doors and windows were reinforced, and he set up a few additional security measures, just in case. Lisa took the kids to one of the bedrooms, trying to keep them calm with games and distractions. Marcus could see the worry in her eyes, though she did her best to hide it from the kids. Not long after they settled in, Marcus received a call from James. "We've got a team heading your way," James said. "They'll be there in an hour. I'm coming with them." Marcus was grateful for the support, but he knew that even with backup, they were in a dangerous situation. Ortega was a master of manipulation and always seemed to have eyes and ears everywhere. Marcus couldn't afford to let his guard down, even for a moment. As they waited for the FBI team to arrive, Marcus sat in the cabin's small living room, his mind racing. How had Ortega found him? Had someone at the FBI leaked his location? Or was Ortega just that good? The uncertainty gnawed at him, making it difficult to focus. But then, a new thought hit him, a terrifying realization. What if Ortega wasn't just after him? What if this whole thing, the arrest, the threats, was part of a larger plan to draw him out? Marcus's heart raced as the pieces started to fall into place. Ortega wasn't just seeking revenge. He was trying to lure Marcus into a trap. And Marcus had walked right into it. Suddenly, Marcus's phone buzzed again. This time, it was a call from an unknown number. He hesitated before answering, but something told him he needed to hear what the caller had to say. Agent Smith, a cold, familiar voice said on the other end. It was Ortega. I told you we were closer than you think, Ortega continued. You should have stayed out of it, but now you've made this personal. You and your family will never be safe. You took everything from me, and now I'm going to take everything from you. Marcus's blood ran cold. Ortega had found them. The cabin, the safe house, none of it mattered anymore. Ortega's network was far-reaching, and he had eyes everywhere. Marcus hung up the phone, his heart pounding in his chest. He grabbed his gun and headed toward the door just as Lisa emerged from the bedroom. What is it? She asked, fear creeping into her voice. They're coming, Marcus said, his voice grim. We need to prepare. As Marcus prepared for the inevitable, his mind raced through every possible scenario. Ortega had found them, but Marcus was not one to be caught off guard. Years of training kicked in, guiding his every move as he checked the locks, reinforced the windows, and positioned Lisa and the kids in the safest part of the cabin. He handed Lisa a handgun, something they had agreed upon long ago, in case of emergencies. Suddenly, Marcus's phone buzzed in his pocket. He glanced at it. James Carter. He answered in a whisper, keeping his eyes on Ortega. Marcus, the team is 5 minutes out, James said quickly. Hold tight. Don't engage unless you have to. Marcus exhaled slowly. 5 minutes. He just had to hold Ortega off for 5 more minutes. But Ortega wasn't going to wait. He gestured to the SUV, and 2 more men stepped out, each armed and looking ready for a fight. Marcus knew he was outnumbered, but he also knew these woods like the back of his hand. He had spent years training in environments like this, using cover and terrain to his advantage. If Ortega thought this would be an easy win, he was sorely mistaken. All right, I'm coming out. Marcus finally called back, his voice loud and steady. He needed to buy time. He tucked his phone into his pocket, keeping the line open so James could hear what was happening. He stepped out of the cabin, his gun hidden behind his back, his eyes locked on Ortega. The 2 men faced each other, the tension between them thick enough to cut with a knife. You've been a thorn in my side for too long, Smith, Ortega said, his smile widening as he took a few steps forward. I've waited a long time for this. And I've been waiting for you to show your face, Marcus replied, his voice cold. You've made a lot of enemies, Ortega. Did you really think you could get away forever? Ortega's smile faltered for a moment. But then he laughed, a deep, unsettling sound. I was close. Closer than you'll ever know. But you ruined that. And now, I'm going to ruin you. Before Marcus could respond, Ortega's men began moving toward him, their guns raised. Marcus was outnumbered, but he wasn't out of options. He quickly ducked behind a tree, firing off a few shots to keep them at bay. Stay with the kids, Marcus said, his voice steady but laced with urgency. Don't open the door unless it's me. Lisa nodded, gripping the gun tightly, her face pale but determined. Sam and Grace, sensing the severity of the situation, huddled close to her, their eyes wide with fear but silent, not fully understanding what was about to happen. The innocence in their eyes made Marcus's heart ache, but he couldn't let that distract him now. Outside, the woods were eerily quiet, save for the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind. The FBI team that James had sent wasn't due to arrive for another 30 minutes, and Marcus knew that could be too late. If Ortega had truly come for him, this showdown was going to happen now. Marcus crouched near the front door, his senses heightened, every muscle in his body tense as he scanned the tree line. He had dealt with men like Ortega before. Ruthless, calculating, always 3 steps ahead. But Ortega's thirst for revenge added an unpredictable element, making him even more dangerous. Suddenly, the sound of an approaching vehicle broke the silence. Marcus's heart raced as he watched a black SUV roll up the dirt path leading to the cabin. Its headlights cut through the growing dusk, illuminating the dense trees. Marcus gripped his gun, ready for whatever came next. The SUV came to a stop about 50 yards away. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, the driver's side door opened, and out stepped a tall, broad-shouldered man wearing a dark suit. Gustavo Ortega. His presence alone was enough to send a chill down Marcus's spine. Ortega had a reputation for being merciless, and his calm, almost casual demeanor only made him more terrifying. Ortega stood there, hands in his pockets, a faint smile playing on his lips as if this were just another business meeting. He looked up at the cabin, his gaze sweeping across the front door. And then he spoke, his voice carrying through the still air. "Agent Smith," Ortega called out, his voice smooth, with a dangerous edge. "I know you're in there. Come out and face me like a man." Marcus didn't respond. He stayed low, watching, waiting for the right moment to act. He wasn't about to walk into Ortega's trap, not without a plan. But Ortega was clever. He knew how to push buttons. "If you don't come out, I'll have no choice but to go in," Ortega continued, his voice darkening. "And we both know what happens if I go in there, don't we?" Marcus's jaw clenched. The threat was clear. Ortega wasn't just after him. He was after his family. And Marcus would die before he let that happen. Just as Marcus thought he would have to make a final stand, the sound of helicopter blades slicing through the air filled the sky. The FBI had arrived, and not a moment too soon. Floodlights illuminated the area, and armed agents descended from the helicopter, their weapons drawn and aimed at Ortega and his men. The aftermath of the confrontation with Ortega sent shockwaves through both Marcus's personal and professional life. The FBI had been quick to contain the situation, but the fact that Ortega had managed to track Marcus down while he was on vacation with his family raised serious questions about the agency's security protocols. The arrest of Ortega and his men was a major win for the FBI, and Marcus was hailed as a hero within the agency. But for Marcus, the victory felt hollow. He had spent his entire career protecting his family from the dangers of his job, and now those dangers had come to his doorstep. He couldn't help but wonder if it was time to step away from the field, to find a way to protect his family without putting them at constant risk. James Carter, while proud of Marcus's handling of the situation, expressed his concerns as well. "We need to reevaluate how we handle our undercover agents' safety," he said during their debriefing. "No one should have to go through what your family just went through." Marcus agreed, but the experience had left him shaken. He knew the FBI would take steps to ensure this kind of situation didn't happen again, but deep down, he understood that there was always a risk. That was the nature of the job. In the months that followed, the Smith family tried to return to normal life. But it wasn't easy. The events at the resort and the confrontation with Ortega had left lasting scars on all of them. Sam and Grace, though resilient, had been deeply affected by the trauma of seeing their father arrested and threatened. Marcus and Lisa worked hard to provide them with a sense of security, but there were moments when the fear would resurface, and the kids would cling to them a little tighter than usual. For Lisa, the experience had been a wake-up call. She had always known that Marcus's job was dangerous, but seeing that danger firsthand had changed her perspective. They had long talks about the future, about what kind of life they wanted for themselves and their children. Marcus's dedication to his work had never been in question, but now they both wondered if it was time for a change. As for Marcus, the ordeal forced him to confront the reality of his situation. He loved his job, but his family's safety had to come first. He began considering roles within the FBI that didn't require fieldwork, positions where he could still make a difference, but without putting his family in harm's way. News of the incident at the resort spread quickly, both in the local community and beyond. The media had latched onto the story of an innocent black family being racially profiled by the police, only to discover that the father was an undercover FBI agent. The resort faced intense backlash, with activists calling for changes in. Ortega's smug expression evaporated as he realized he was outnumbered. His men hesitated, unsure of what to do next. Marcus stepped out from behind the tree, his gun still in hand, as he watched the FBI agents surround Ortega's group. James Carter emerged from the helicopter, his face grim but relieved. He signaled for his team to move in, and within seconds, Ortega and his men were disarmed and taken into custody. Marcus lowered his weapon, his heart pounding in his chest. It was over. Ortega was finally caught, and his family was safe. But the relief he felt was short-lived, replaced by the weight of everything they had just been through. James approached Marcus, clapping a hand on his shoulder. "You did good, Marcus. This could have gone a lot worse." Marcus nodded, but his mind was elsewhere, on Lisa and the kids, who had been hiding in the cabin, waiting for this nightmare to end. He turned and hurried back to the cabin, throwing open the door to find Lisa standing there, her face pale but calm, the kids clinging to her legs. "It's over," Marcus said softly, pulling them all into his arms. "It's finally over." But as they embraced, Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed forever. In the days following the arrest of Gustavo Ortega and the close call at the resort, the Smith family returned home, but life was far from what it had been before. The traumatic events had left deep emotional scars, especially for Marcus, who was haunted by the reality that he had nearly lost everything he held dear. Back at home, Marcus found himself struggling to return to a sense of normalcy. He had faced dangerous criminals before, he had been in life-threatening situations, but those battles had always been confined to his work. This time, the violence had breached the walls of his home, his sanctuary, and the people he loved most had been caught in the crossfire. Lisa, ever supportive, did her best to help her husband recover emotionally, but she too was changed. Her trust in the world, in the idea that they could ever truly be safe, had been shattered. She'd spent nights awake, staring at the ceiling, wondering how close they had come to losing it all. She was grateful that Marcus's FBI training had saved them, but at the same time, it scared her. Could this happen again? Would it? Would they ever truly be safe as long as Marcus continued working in dangerous operations? Sam and Grace were not oblivious to what had happened. Though young, they had felt the fear of that night and the tension that followed. Sam, who had always admired his father's strength, became more distant. He hadn't said it out loud, but Marcus could tell that his son was grappling with the reality of who his father was, a man whose job could put them all in danger. Grace, on the other hand, was more openly emotional, clinging to Lisa and Marcus, her trust in the world shaken. The family sought therapy, working together to heal the fractures that the incident had left behind. There were hard conversations about trust, fear, and the future. Marcus knew he had to make a decision about his career. He couldn't keep putting his family through this, and the weight of that decision pressed down on him every day. Meanwhile, the community where the Smith family had vacationed and where the racial profiling incident had occurred was facing its own reckoning. The media coverage of the event had spread like wildfire. National news outlets picked up the story of a black family being arrested while on vacation, only for it to be revealed that the father was an undercover FBI agent. The story had gone viral, sparking outrage and prompting discussions about systemic racism in law enforcement, particularly in small towns where such biases often went unchecked. The resort itself faced intense scrutiny. Initially, the resort had tried to downplay the incident, stating that they were simply following protocol and acting on a report from other guests who found Marcus suspicious. But as the details of the case emerged, it became clear that this was a case of racial profiling, and the resort's management was soon overwhelmed with backlash. Activists, both local and national, descended upon the town, organizing protests and demanding accountability. The resort's staff underwent mandatory diversity training, and the town's mayor held a press conference vowing to improve race relations and implement reforms in the local police department. The police officers who had wrongfully arrested Marcus were placed on administrative leave pending an investigation. For many in the town, this incident was a wake-up call. It forced residents to confront the deep-seated biases that existed within their own community, biases that many had ignored or denied for far too long. Local activists, who had long been fighting against racial profiling in the area, saw this as a turning point. They organized town hall meetings, inviting citizens to share their experiences with racism and calling for more inclusive policies. However, not everyone was receptive. Some in the town defended the police and the resort, claiming that they had simply been doing their jobs. These voices, though quieter, reflected the entrenched resistance to change that existed in many communities across the country. The town became a microcosm of the larger national debate over race, policing, and justice. At the surface, things appeared to settle. The FBI had Ortega in custody, and Marcus's swift thinking and bravery had prevented a tragedy. The agency considered it a major win in their fight against human trafficking, and Marcus was commended for his work. But beneath that professional success, something had changed within Marcus, his family, and even the town itself. As the weeks passed, Marcus found himself at a crossroads. He loved his work. He had spent his entire career protecting people, bringing criminals to justice, and making the world a safer place. But now, the question of whether his work was worth the risk to his family loomed over him. The decision wasn't easy, but it was necessary. As Marcus and his family focused on rebuilding their lives, the town where the incident had occurred was also undergoing changes. The local police department instituted new training protocols aimed at eliminating racial bias. Officers were required to attend workshops on community relations and implicit bias, and the department brought in outside consultants to review their practices. The resort, after facing weeks of protests and calls for boycotts, also began to change. They revamped their hiring practices to create a more diverse workforce, and they implemented stricter guidelines to prevent racial profiling by both staff and guests. The resort's owner issued a public apology, acknowledging that their handling of the situation had been deeply flawed and that they were committed to doing better. The town, which had once been known as a peaceful vacation spot, was now associated with a national conversation about race and justice. But in some ways, that conversation was exactly what the town needed. The incident had forced people to confront uncomfortable truths, and though change was slow, it was happening. After long talks with Lisa and hours of introspection, Marcus made a decision that surprised even himself. He would leave the field. For the Smith family, the journey of healing was far from over, but there were signs of hope. Sam and Grace slowly began to recover from the trauma, and with time, they started to talk about their fears. Therapy helped them understand that what happened wasn't their father's fault, and Marcus worked hard to rebuild their trust. Marcus and Lisa found solace in each other. Their marriage had always been strong, but this experience had tested them in ways they hadn't expected. Now they felt closer than ever, bonded by their shared survival and determination to protect their family. Marcus, now working in a less dangerous role within the FBI, spent more time at home. He coached Sam's baseball team and helped Grace with her school projects. He was more present, more engaged, and more at peace with the life he had chosen. The decision to step away from fieldwork had been the hardest of his career, but it had also been the most important. It wasn't a decision he took lightly, but after everything that had happened, he knew it was the right one. His family needed stability, safety, and a future where they wouldn't have to live in fear of the next dangerous mission. The idea of sitting behind a desk wasn't appealing, but Marcus knew he could still make a difference from within the FBI, working in intelligence or operations management. The day he submitted his request for reassignment, he felt a strange mix of relief and sadness. It was the end of an era for him, the closing of a chapter that had defined him for so long. But as he walked out of his office for the last time, he knew he had made the right choice. For the first time in a long time, Marcus felt like he could breathe. As Marcus and his family focused on rebuilding their lives, the town where the incident had occurred was also undergoing changes. The local police department instituted new training protocols aimed at eliminating racial bias. Officers were required to attend workshops on community relations and implicit bias, and the department brought in outside consultants to review their practices. The resort, after facing weeks of protests and calls for boycotts, also began to change. They revamped their hiring practices to create a more diverse workforce, and they implemented stricter guidelines to prevent racial profiling by both staff and guests. The resort's owner issued a public apology, acknowledging that their handling of the situation had been deeply flawed and that they were committed to doing better. The town, which had once been known as a peaceful vacation spot, was now associated with a national conversation about race and justice. But in some ways, that conversation was exactly what the town needed. The incident had forced people to confront uncomfortable truths, and though change was slow, it was happening.